Welcome to Ulterior Moto, where we feature real-world product reviews, rides, and rider profiles, information about track days, how-tos, all that good stuff about motorcycles. Today, we are going to do a comparison between the Woodcraft adjustable rear stand and the Vortex V3 rear stand. So, I've got my Woodcraft recently received here in pieces, so I'll go ahead and assemble that and show you how that's done. The Vortex was pretty, self-explanatory, so let's check them out. So the Woodcraft chassis comes all in one piece there. No assembly required on that end of it, whereas the Vortex comes in basically three main pieces. You need to bolt together here, and then a couple of spool adapters, some nuts to locate the width for those spool adapters, and that's it. With the Woodcraft, each side has an upright leg, a spool adapter, a quick clamp, and a spring-loaded pin. So you'll notice on the upright there is a groove machined into each side there. As this slides into the tube, that actually locates around the axle, and that prevents the tube from twisting. There is a gradient here. There are 17 marks here, and they're all numbered. The spaces between them are 1 to 16, which is a little bit curious, and I'll get into that here soon. There are 5 holes drilled into each side, and those will dictate how high these arms go. These are spaced half an inch apart, so that'll give you an indication of your increments as far as lifting up the rear tire. So let's get these started. So the quick clamps here are basically like a bicycle seat post clamp. They do have a little ridge on there to stop it from going all the way on. So it locates it nicely at the top. Slide in that tube, and you can clamp it at whatever increment you feel you need. And here's the curious part about that. These pins go through the front of the chassis into those holes I showed you a moment ago. There are only 5 of them, so why there are 16 spaces numbered, I'm not really sure. Even in the manual, they say, don't put a load on these with only the quick fasten clamp. That said, I'm not sure why those gradients are there. I'm really not even sure why the clamp is there, but we're going to go with it. So I'm going to put this at its lowest setting, and I'll tell you why I'm going to do that in a moment. Shove the pin in there. Put our spool adapter in. Speaking of which, I want to point out just how nicely these are made. There is just an absolutely beautiful weld between this rod and plate. It's completely flush. It looks fantastic. And there is some heft to this as well. They didn't skimp out on the wall thickness of this. So again, quick clamp with the ridge on top. Tube in all the way down. If you hear some chewing and snorting in the background, that's the new shop puppy. She's teething, so she's been chewing on a bone here. All right, let's put these adapters in there. So what I'm going to do here is just lightly fasten these. Just barely, so they can slide. There's a flat machined on the top of this, so the the set screw sits right nicely on there, and you always get the same angle. All right, just enough so they won't rotate. So now, when I go to set this later, wherever the spools direct these, Hey, there she is. That's where I'll set them for good. Hey, Cookie. All right. All right, well, she's not camera shy, is she? So with the Vortex, we have a square stock. Inside of a square stock, there is a bolt that threads into a nut, which is welded on to the square stock. And that's an important distinction. And I'll compare that to the Woodcraft as well. When I first got this stand and I assembled it, the welds around the nut broke. And I was pretty disappointed in that because I knew Vortex to be a solid brand. So I called my retailer. They had Vortex ship me a new part for this. And from there I took it pretty easy. But I was constantly frustrated about these sliding back and forth when I'm coming into the pits. It's really annoying if they're not matching up and I got to slide them around again. So I kept torquing it down little by little by little. And eventually, just 2 track days in, the weld started to break again. So at that point, I figured I have had enough and moved on to try out the Woodcraft. So, by comparison, the Woodcraft uses these set screws that are machined into a block of steel. So that is all threaded inside there. There are no welds to break. So I am confident I'm not going to have the same problem with the Woodcraft that I had on the Vortex. All right. The second issue is with the Vortex is the height that it lifts the wheel up. This Vortex, as you can see here, as tall as it is, am I gonna lose my Alan? No? Okay. As tall as it is, lifts up the rear wheel on this SV650 5.5 inches. That is really excessive. So, causes two problems. One, it's really hard to lift the bike up. And two, it lifts it up so far that it makes tire changing, wheel changing, that whole episode more difficult than it needs to be. So let's take a look at that effort problem. I'm not exaggerating that for effect. I weigh about 175 pounds, and it took a lot of my body weight to lift this bike up. Now I'm going to set it back down, and we're going to take a look at the way rear stands work and why that height requires so much effort. Let's take a quick look at how a rear stand actually works. So it is a pretty simple machine. It gives you mechanical advantage in the form of a lever. As we know, a lever is pretty basic, consists of the lever itself and a fulcrum and the weight. In this case, the weight is our spool, the fulcrum is our wheel, and the handle is our lever. And as the rear end is lifted up, our fulcrum actually moves and it becomes easier and easier. And then at the very end, our weight actually goes on the same side of the fulcrum as our lever, and that's what holds everything down. Now, your mechanical advantage is determined by the ratio of two distances, from your weight to your fulcrum and from your fulcrum to the end of your lever. Let's take a measurement, see how much mechanical advantage we get with the Vortex. We're looking at about 12 inches from weight to fulcrum and about 12 inches from lever to fulcrum. So our ratio is 1:1. Our mechanical advantage is 0. That's why it's so difficult. Now, for the sake of argument, I've put the Vortex here at its lowest setting so we can compare the level of effort and the geometries of the two. That was really easy. All right, so we saw how easy it was. Let's take a look at the measurements, find out why. Our weight to fulcrum is about 6.5 inches. Our fulcrum to lever is about 16.5 inches. So we're approaching a little short of it, but we're approaching about a 3-to-1 ratio. So if you're lifting 150 pounds with this, you're lifting all those 150 pounds. If you're lifting 150 pounds with that, you're only applying the force of, I don't know, roughly 60 pounds. That's why it's so much easier. So let's take a look at this Woodcraft and see how much it actually lifts it off the ground. Now we know 5.5 inches with the Vortex. I'm going to use a couple blocks just to demonstrate. It's not going to give us an exact measurement, but it's a 2x4, so we know it's 1.5 inches. It's less than that. This tile, which I know is 3/4 of an inch, it's greater than that. So we're looking at, roughly about 1 inch, let's say. Now it has 1/2 inch increments on the riser, so 5 of those. We got 4 of them left. We got another 2 inches, we can lift it up. That's more than enough, right? Even at that, it's still less than this Vortex here. So even at its worst, the Woodcraft would not be as hard to lift a motorcycle as it is with this Vortex. And I'll tell you, this is my easy bike. If I were to lift my Speed Twin with the Vortex, I feel like I'm going to drop it every time I do. Unless I had a front stand for it or something like that could hold the front end. I wouldn't trust it. I wouldn't trust myself. So there you have it. I think the Vortex, while it's, they make a lot of great products, including the front stand that I have, and I've been using it for maybe 15 years. It's fantastic. It doesn't quite measure up. So let's take a look at some of the other features as well. So we looked at the basics, but there's a couple other things that are actually a little bit nicer about the Vortex and some things that are nice about the Woodcraft. So a great feature that the Woodcraft has that the Vortex does not are these. So there's a couple rods that are welded onto the chassis. So when you're doing a rear tire swap, typically with any other rear stand that I've ever used, when you pull that axle out, you just have to set it on the ground. And hopefully you prepared for that and you put a towel down or something like that. But with the Woodcraft, I can just slide that onto the rod. And there's one on each side, so I've got one for my axle, and I've got another for the nut and all the spacers. That is super handy and really thoughtful. Another thing about the two that we can compare is the wheels. So the looks are a little deceptive in this department. The Woodcraft wheels are a solid one piece and they look enormous compared to the Vortex. Really, they're 5 inches. The Vortex is 4.5. I don't have any problems with either one of them. I do have the feeling from my experience with a trackside stand that I had for many, many years is that when the wheels have a rubber surrounding on them, that can over time degrade and in my experience with that particular one just fall off, and that makes a miserable rear stand because it's just chunka over everything, even if it's smooth. What I do like about the Vortex though, even though they do have the two-piece wheels, is that it's really smooth and really quiet when you're shuffling your bike around. Another feature I want to point out is, and it's maybe a little unfinished looking about the Vortex, but it does have these plastic clips. These plastic clips go on here. There is a hole that they fit into, like so. And they drag around the ground. They wear down, but they also don't scratch. So if you have a painted floor like this, that's pretty nice, because any little tiny rock or something that gets under it or in front of it, it's not going to drag it along the ground. It's really nice and smooth. It may be not the most elegant solution to have something that just snaps on and off like that, so easily at least. The Woodcraft does have a flat in a similar location, and it is aluminum, I believe, and it's welded to the chassis, so I don't have to worry about that falling off and getting lost at some point. But it's pretty smooth. As long as your surface underneath is pretty smooth, that's fine. And being metal, I'm not really worried that it's going to wear out over time if I'm at the paddock dragging it around as well. So the last thing that we want to cover here, right? So we've determined, and I think you're with me here, that the Woodcraft is definitely the better of the two. How much more do I have to pay for that? Well, a little less than you'd think, actually. The Vortex here retails for $150. The Woodcraft retails for $185. And for those extra $35, I think you're getting a much, much better product. I would like to see Vortex address some of the issues they have here. Really, it can't be that difficult to adjust the height on this and make it a far better product. They also need to adjust the welds or to address that in some way. And I think they'd have a much better product, because the finish on this is really nice. It's a satin textured powder coat. It looks great, but it doesn't quite hit the mark for me. All right, I hope you enjoyed this review, and I hope you learned something from it, and look forward to seeing you around.